It's time for good energy, and I'm Dr. Julie, and welcome to Bodyful Day 130. We are talking about bloating and the senses. This is the last day of our series on bloating and the senses, and we are talking about the kinesthetic sense. The kinesthetic sense is the sense of muscles and joints, and we're going to talk about how those muscles and joints can be used, the sense from muscles and joints can be used as good energy in, even though they signal stress. All right, let's start with our basics. Take a deep breath in and release. Take a deep breath in, breathe in, expand in the belly, expand in the chest, expand in the sinuses, and kind of just rock back a little bit. And exhale. And since we are talking about bloating and the senses, I want you to breathe into your most favoritist meal. It could have been Halloween candy. Your most favoritist meal that happens to make your gut not happy with you. Take a deep breath in and release. Now, we kind of did that one earlier because I remember breathing into shakes, ice cream shakes, and that's kind of what I breathe into. But every once in a while, Thanksgiving dinner just kind of makes me feel all bloated and yucky. So that's another place to go. All right. So we are talking about the kinesthetic sense. And remember, the kinesthetic sense is the sense of muscles and joints, where what is moving and where your joints are in space. Now, the interesting thing about that is that they have sensory receptors that exist in the joints themselves. So they have things that are called Golgi tendon apparati, which actually sit in the tendons and tell how much the tendons are stretching. And you also have sensors inside the muscles, and the muscles then send signals about how much they are stressing. Now, if they are being stressed or stretched. Now, you will recall earlier in the week, we talked about the fact that colic, which is something that babies get, they cry and cry and cry because they're gassy, is what we as adults get too when we get bloating. Colic is a very simple word that says gas in a contained area in the body, gas within an organ. That is what colic is. And so we sense, just like babies, gas within an organ when it's in the small intestines, it's in the large intestines, it's in the stomach. We can sense that bloating. We can sense that expansion of the tube. Sometimes it's on the outside, like we can feel like our abs, when we eat too much. You can tell your abs just are, they're not going to tighten up. But also we can sense that bloating that exists lower down, like there's an air bubble or something that is just not, things are stoppered up and they're not the way they're supposed to be. And what happens at that time is, for whatever reason, part of the front end of that tube gets closed off, and then fermentation happens. Fermentation happens because what's in your gut should just be going around, dropping off the good stuff as it goes, collecting the bad stuff, and emptying itself out. But if there is a stoppage, for whatever reason, too much roughage, you poofed a bunch of microbes. In fact, my oldest and I were having a discussion about fungus, gut fungus, and he's like, how do you end up with gut fungus? I'm like, you always have candida in your gut. What happens is that sometimes we eat something that flares that candida group and gets you out of, we call it dysbiosis, gets you out of balance in your microbiome, such that the candida is now way larger in population than it actually is supposed to be for you to be able to function. And so that can happen not just with the candida, but it can happen with any of your, anywhere between 1 trillion and 10 trillion, because we are unknown as to how many other microbes we carry with us. There are some estimates that they're the same amount as ourselves, which is about 1 trillion, and there are others that say that we are 10 times more other things than we are ourselves. We're probably somewhere in the middle. But the idea being, you have a whole bunch of stuff inside of you that is hanging out, that is symbiotic, that is not symbiotic, but anyway, you have all these little bits and pieces, and if you feed them the wrong thing at the wrong time with the gut-brain axis, things get a little off. One of them just goes, and you have this huge overgrowth, which then can block a tube. And if it blocks a tube, then you get fermentation. Fermentation is when your food doesn't go all the way through, but instead sits like you're fermenting beer, like you're fermenting a sourdough loaf, like you're fermenting anything that we ferment. Kombucha, water kefir, you name it. When you get a bunch of stuff together with a bunch of fungus or bacteria, you get gas. You get air bubbles. Bubble, 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 bubble. And now you've got kinesthetic sense, you've got expansion, you've got stress on that tube, and you have colic. So how do we use, so all of this was in, of course, to tell you the fact that energy to help your bloated gut equals good energy and minus stressors. And your sense, your kinesthetic sense is what's telling you that you have a stressor. You have a huge stressor. So how can you, because colic is your stressor, how can you use your kinesthetic sense, muscles and joints, to give you some good energy in? And I am going to give you one of my favorite pieces of advice that I give to any patient that walks in with chronic right hip pain. Chronic right hip pain. If your right hip always hurts, if your right hip is always out when you wake up in the morning, if your right hip is always out after you eat dinner, if your right hip is always out any time of the day, even if you see a chiropractor, it's always your right hip, your right hip, your right hip. It's probably not the fact that you're always sitting cockeyed. It's probably the fact that you have one of the largest stoppage points in your intestines is sitting right in front of that right hip. And that stoppage point is called your ileocecal valve. The ileocecal valve, get this, is a muscle. It's a muscle. It's a muscular valve. So it's kinesthetic. It is a muscular valve that decides, it's the connection between the small intestine and the large intestine. It's sitting right here. It decides whether or not the stuff in the small intestine has been processed correctly and there's nothing scary in there. So it opens, there we go. It opens and allows food into your large intestine. And then your large intestine processes it and then you're done with it. But the problem is if that ileocecal valve senses that there is something that is not good, it will close up and it will stay closed. And now you get all this fermentation and alcohol and rotting right here, which sits right in front of that right hip, sits right in front of your sacral, sacrum and fifth lumbar, first lumbar vertebrae above the sacrum, which is called the fifth lumbar. And you have all of this inflammation, and none of those want to be anywhere near that scary, ucky fermentation. So how do you fix it? Well, I'm going to give you the simple lowdown. You can fix it by massaging it. All right? So how do we do it? And I am totally not dressed in the right clothes, but we'll make do with it. All right, so here's my hip bone, right here. The first thing to do is find your hip bone. Second thing is to make your hand into a blade. We're doing blades. And then you're going to stick your pinky on your hip bone. Pinky on hip bone. And you're going to go over 4 fingers widths from your pinky. 1, 2, 3, 4, drop in. That is the approximate location of your ileocecal valve. And in fact, if you have chronic right hip pain, weak psoas muscles, which means that this hip flexor gets tired a lot, you are going to find that that is very tender to push on. We are going to use the kinesthetic sense to help move things around. So you will just go in and you'll dig as gently. You don't want to go in and kind of rip things out, but you're going to let your fingers go in until you feel pain, and then you're just going to kind of massage up. I just kind of do a pulling motion. And that pulling motion has a tendency to get all the inflammation around, because you're kind of massaging it open. You're kind of saying it's okay. And even if you're not massaging it open, you're massaging the garbage around one side and you're massaging the garbage around the other side. And I never do more than 20 of those. If it hurts, I always massage up for a count of 20, and then I just let it go. And I'm like, I will revisit it later. You don't want to overdo this one. And so remember that if you are concerned about this, if you do have chronic hip pain and you're like, I'm not sure if I should do this, remember this is for education. And if you have questions, contact your care provider and say, hey, I just learned this new technique. What do you think about it? And then go ahead and see if it works for you. I will tell you that I have a lot of patients that really enjoy being able to fix their own colic. And that is one of the major blockage points for colic issues. And it happens to correspond with right hip pain. So that is using your muscles, giving good energy into those muscles to help relieve bloating. All right. So I hope this week has been helpful. I hope you have gotten something out of everything we've talked about. We've talked about the sense of sight, though I hijacked that for the basics. We talked about the sense of smell, again, the brain-gut connection. We talked about hearing, gut-brain connection again. But we also talked about the fact that the alarm sense can actually trigger a change in biochemistry. We talked about the sense of touch, and how that is that colic issue. Taste, the vestibular sense, and of course today we talked about the kinesthetic. Join me next week. I forgot to look up what the topic is. I already have it all planned out, but I planned it out like a month ago. So join me next week when we start a new series on whatever it is and the senses. If you are interested, you can sign up for 52 weeks of healing, or otherwise known as Energy for You. Go to thehealingequation.com and there is a place to sign up for that. That is this, plus a little bit more about how to use the healing equation in everyday experiences and how to make these little changes. Like I give you more information about bloating, I give you more information about plantar fasciitis, and how you can bring good energy in and what stressors you can get rid of so that you can make this a healthier experience, so that you have enough energy to do what you want. All right, have a terrific Sunday, and I will see you back here tomorrow. Take care. Oh, let's finish it off. Deep breath in. And release. See you tomorrow.